Imagine you just sold your home, or you finally found the home of your dreams. The offer was accepted, the agreement was signed, the deposit has now been delivered. Then the unthinkable happens. The brokerage shuts down. Would you know what happens to your money? How safe is your deposit? Is it protected? How do you get it back? If 50,000 or even 100,000 was sitting in a trust account, would you feel completely confident that the money was safe? Most people assume that the system protects them, but after recent brokerage shutdowns in Ontario, many buyers and sellers are quietly asking the very same question. Is my deposit really secure? Today, we're talking about real estate deposits and consumer protection in Ontario. How safe is your deposit? So, ladies, good morning. So, this is, I think, a really timely topic because of all the recent occurrences in the news of late. And before we dive into it, maybe what we could do is really define what a deposit is, because I think a lot of times people confuse a deposit with a down payment.
Yeah, absolutely. So the deposit is what it is when you purchase a property, you put a deposit down and that deposit gets held in trust. That becomes part of your down payment. But that goes into the real estate companies, typically the real estate company's trust account, and it's held until closing. But it's not and it is part of your down payment. It becomes part of your down payment.
I think it's usually just put there so that the seller can feel comfortable that you have some skin in the game and that you've got, your hopefully your ducks in a row in order to purchase their house.
So I think with some of the recent occurrences, I've heard from clients and just people in general that they're worried about their deposit and they're wondering whether they even need to put a deposit down on a purchase. And as you said, Ruth, I think one of the things that the deposit shows is that the buyer, as you said, has some skin in the game and actually has some money. And I think when we're talking about that, we have to sort of put ourselves in the shoes of the seller. So just imagine for a second that you had your house up for sale and you sold it, let's just say beginning of March, with a closing maybe in July 1st. Everything has now been firmed, all the conditions have been removed. It's a firm deal. If there was no money held in a deposit, held as a deposit, how confident would you feel about that deal closing, or how confident would you feel that the buyer just doesn't change their mind and go somewhere else? So even though there is a firm agreement that the buyer, once they remove their conditions, is obligated to close on that deal, I think having the deposit, just as you said, put some skin in the game and makes them think twice about it, because whatever that deposit is held in trust, they don't have access to that deposit if they decide to move on. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. And especially in a declining market that we're in right now, that you have some proof that the buyer is going to close. I mean, imagine that a buyer is putting what would stop people if they're not putting a deposit? What would stop them from buying one house and realizing that this one is not good, the market's come down, so I'll go buy a different house and I'll just walk away from that one. I mean, there is still recourse for the seller in that case because you are signing a legal binding document. However, I think it shows that you're serious about closing the deal.
So I think that sort of covers why we are asking for a deposit when you're purchasing a home. And the other thing is that sometimes the deposit alone can make a big difference in an offer that a seller decides to select. So I know when there were multiple offers, you'd get all these offers. Some of them would be similar in price, some of them would be different in price. I know for myself, I had an offer where someone had paid, I think it was like 200 or $300,000 more on the price, around the 2 million price point, and they had a $40,000 deposit, which seemed really weak for that purchase price and the long closing that they were asking. And somebody else came in with a huge deposit, several $100,000, for less money, and the seller ended up going with the one for considerably less money, but a good deposit because they felt secure that these people were, first of all, sincere in purchasing the home. They had a lot of money as a deposit, and they ended up going with that offer. So it sort of gives you the perspective of where sellers are coming from in terms of deposits.
I think sometimes we get the wrong impression about, especially multiple offers, and we only think about price. But definitely, all three of us know the deposit makes a huge difference when you're looking at three or four offers. If especially if one of the deposits is small, it really is something that you have to look at more than once and think about seriously.
Yeah, what I was going to say is, so is a deposit legally required in a real estate deal? I think the answer to that question, and I think I'm going to preface this by saying this is just, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm from what my understanding of selling real estate. The deposit is not legally required. However, if you were a seller, I mean, if you're a buyer today, you could go out and put an offer down on a house and say, how much of a deposit am I giving? Nothing, zero, or $100. It's up for negotiation. Is the seller going to take that? Is the question. And I would say probably 100% of the time, unless it's like a private sale, there's something else going on. But if there's realtors representing you, the selling realtor is going to explain that there's no deposit here. So you could try it, but it won't get accepted. It's just like price, right? I can put an offer on a house that's 200,000 below what the seller is asking. It doesn't mean the seller has to accept that, and they don't have to accept that you don't have a deposit. And so it's just become common practice that we have a deposit. But I mean, they've gone up significantly, right? When we first started selling real estate, what were they? $500, $1,000?
I remember one time when I was doing an offer, I had a deposit of $1,000, and the other agent said, "Oh my God, I've never seen a deposit that big." Talking many, many years ago. I'm showing my age, but
But you know what, though, Ruth? My point, and to your point, when I say the deposits are much more today, I don't mean they are much more today, obviously because prices are higher, but they're much more today in relation to what the price of the house was, right? Like they're a higher percentage. So we would, $1,000, $500 deposit versus what the house was, the deposits tend to be bigger today in percentage wise is kind of what I'm getting at, right? Because it does make a difference, right? How do you know that people are going to close? It makes a difference, and especially in a multiple offer situation, people are sometimes going to take an offer that has a bigger deposit. That's one way of, see, people think when they get in a multiple offer it's always about price, but it's not. When an agent says you can improve your offer, improving your offer can be changing the closing, giving a bigger deposit. That can be improving your offer, right? So that's why sometimes buyers get caught up in this, well, they want me to get into a bidding war. No, it's not necessarily about that. You can improve your offer in other ways, and the deposit is one of them.
And so I think the difference too is many years ago when those deposits were $500 and $1,000, those deposits were not in a trust account. They were just in the brokerage account and they weren't insured. So as we're talking about how safe is your deposit today, we should make it clear that generally speaking, as you said, the deposits are held in the listing brokerage's trust account. And both realtors representing the buyer and the seller are signing on the agreement of purchase and sale that they agree that deposit money will be put in the brokerage's trust account. And that trust account has an insurance on it that the realtors are paying for, not the brokerages, but the realtors are paying for. And that deposit money is insured up to $200,000. So as long as your deposit is $200,000 or less, it would be insured.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I think the fact that what like what's come out recently in the news, I think it's a good opportunity for people to ask questions. I don't think it should be alarming. And the reason I say that is because it is such big news because it very rarely happens. So if this kind of stuff happened all the time, it wouldn't be such big news, right? It's everybody, I think every realtor in Ontario was shocked by what happened. And that is a testament to the fact that this is something that doesn't happen very often.
and that is because the deposits are how it's handled is regulated, how it's struck, how the whole system is structured is regulated, and the trust accounts are actually audited by the Real Estate Council of Ontario, or RICO as we call it.
And say what you will, The safeguards that they have in effect that you're talking about, Ruth, are what picked this up. Were there some things that were not handled properly in this situation? Absolutely. There's no question. However, the safeguards that are in place are what picked this up. And that's why we have those safeguards in place. So I think that deposits today are very, very, I think they're very safe. And I think really there is no cause, in my opinion, there isn't cause for alarm. Does that mean you shouldn't ask questions? No, you should be asking questions. I've never had anybody ask me what happens to the deposit, a buyer or a seller. They don't know. I usually explain it, but they don't. Nobody has ever asked me that question. They just hand it over. I say, you need a deposit, they hand it over. So I'm pretty diligent in telling them where it's going and what happens with it, but it's not because they've asked me.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that when it goes into that trust account, it's not available funds for the brokerage to use, right? It's in a separate account from their operating funds, and it's a separate account that's not to be touched. And that is the part that's regulated.
Exactly. Meaning the brokerage, if the brokerage had to close out every deal tomorrow, they need to have enough money. The money that's coming into that trust account, there has to be enough there. They can't roll it into their operating expenses and work from it. So if there's whatever amount there is in there, has to be able to close every single one of those deals.
Right. And I think that's where some of the issues have come up recently through those audits is those deposits have in some cases been used for things other than releasing for the particular purchase agreement of purchase and sale. And so maybe that's another thing that we can briefly talk about. What are the conditions in which a brokerage can release those deposit funds? Obviously, one would be if the deal closes. So if a deal closes, that deposit is released so that it can become part of the down payment. What are some of the other ways in which the deposit funds can be released?
It can be released if both the buyer and the seller mutually agree to release the funds in whichever way they decide to mutually release them.
So that would be, for example, an offer comes in, it's conditional on financing and home inspection, but at the time the agreement is agreed upon, that's when the deposit is delivered. They've got, say, 5 or 7 banking days to do their due diligence. They find out they can't get the financing. Both parties agree to release each other so that the buyer can move on and the seller can resell their house. And in that case, they would do a mutual release, just so that people who might not understand what a mutual release is. So that's two. Third one would be a court order. So the money stays in the funds until the courts decide otherwise. And that would be if there was some kind of dispute or the deal didn't close. And just because a deal doesn't close and one of the lawyers says, I'll release the funds, the brokerage can't do it. They have to do it under those circumstances. Have we missed anything?
No, I think that's it. And that's what I get more, I will say, more questions about from the seller is the seller saying, yes, I have a deposit, but what happens if the buyer doesn't close? Because a lot of people think, and this might be a whole conversation for another podcast, but sometimes the seller thinks if they don't close, I automatically get that deposit. And that's not what happens. In that case, so it goes back to what we said, it either gets mutual release because they both agree on how that's going to be dispersed. And if they don't, then it sits in that trust account until somebody takes it to court and the courts make a judgment on it.
And that could be many years later. That doesn't have to be, if they don't agree, they don't agree. And someone then has to make the decision, which is the court that makes that decision for them.
We've agreed that your deposits are safe, they are insured. There are some things that buyers and sellers can do in addition to asking some questions. So one of them would be to make sure that on the agreement of purchase and sale, it says that it's held by the listing brokerage and the words in trust and signed off at the bottom. What other things can people do? They can confirm that the brokerage has in fact received the deposit funds. So you should, as a buyer, get a receipt for those deposit funds. And as a seller, you should also get a copy of that receipt from your realtor saying, yep, the brokerage has got those funds. It's in trust. What are some of the other things they can potentially do?
Well, I think one thing that gets overlooked a lot is that on an agreement of purchase and sale, there is a section where we would sign as the realtor saying that we are insured. And that's important, right? That we're insured under errors and omissions, and that it is, we're licensed realtors, right? So what else should be, I think the only other safeguard, I think, and this would come more from the real estate agent who's acting for you as a buyer. This probably comes down to why there's a good reason you should have a buyer agency agreement with a realtor, because they're acting in your best interest, and they would know if you're worried about the brokerage that it's going into, or maybe let's just say it's a real estate company that you've never heard of that has that property listed, and the agent may say, let's hold it in our brokerage's trust account as opposed to their brokerage's trust account. And I'm just using the example of, just because you haven't heard of a real estate company doesn't mean it's not a good real estate company, and the size of the real estate company doesn't matter. However, if you're unsure, talk to your realtor that's acting for you and ask them, how is my deposit safe? Should I be worried about this? Because that could bring up a discussion, and the realtor may say, yeah, let's hold it in our trust account instead of theirs if there's a concern. That's something that's open for negotiation. Everything on the offer is open for negotiation.
That's right. And as long as both parties agree to those negotiations, it can be done. But I guess the long and short of it is that in Ontario, I think your deposits are safe as long as they're under $200,000 and that you're working with a registered realtor. So they're signing off that it's in the brokerages, whichever side it is, real estate, and the words trust account, commission, deposit trust account needs to be there.
But I think they're very safe. There's billions of dollars, billions that go through these trust accounts every year in Ontario. And so I'll just reiterate what I said before. The fact that this news of what happened was so shocking to everybody just proves the point that they are very safe, and this doesn't happen very often.
Okay, thank you so much for all the input, and hopefully you enjoyed this podcast. If you do, don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll see you at the next one.